tonight's public lecture. This is a series of lectures that we run throughout the year that covers a broad range of topics in the area of food and health. And really what we're trying to do is bring you the latest scientific evidence underpinning a series of hot topics in food and nutrition. And tonight we're going to look at the very topical subject of vitamin D. And my colleague, Dr. Aifric O'Sullivan, is going to deliver a talk entitled How to Keep Your Vitamin D Levels Up This Winter. Following the talk, we'll have a series of, a Q&A session where you can ask questions, and Aifric will be joined by Dr. Aisling McCurt, who will also join in our Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions, I ask you to post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will deal with as many of these questions as we can at the end. So it is a great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening. So Aifric is an assistant professor in UCD's School of Agriculture and Food Science. She leads a research team in the Institute of Food and Health, which focuses on two key areas of human nutrition. Number one, sustainable diets, and number two, vitamin D. And tonight, Aifric is going to talk about the importance of vitamin D in our diets, particularly at this time of the year. And she will touch on some recent research looking to see if we can increase the amount of vitamin D that we get from food. As I said, at the Q&A sessions, we're going to be joined by Dr. Aisling McCurt. And Aisling is a HCPC and CORU registered dietitian. She's experienced working both in acute and community settings and is currently working in private practice. She completed a PhD in UCD in 2021, where she worked alongside Aifric to investigate how vitamin D absorption can be improved using food fortification. So thank you very much to both Aifric and Aisling for taking the time to join us this evening. And I'm delighted now to hand over to Aifric.
Thanks, Lorraine, and thank you to everybody for listening in this evening. As Lorraine already introduced, I'm going to kind of start with some background information about vitamin D, why it's so important in our diets. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk more about the research that we're doing here in UCD to look and see essentially how we could try to improve our intakes. So it's well known that in Ireland, our vitamin D levels are not great, and that's down to a couple of things, but primarily the lack of sunlight, particularly at this time of year. So I think most of you will have heard or will be familiar with the fact that we can make vitamin D when our skin is exposed to sunlight. But at this time of year, we get very little sunlight in Ireland, as you know. And so we get very little from our own synthesis, and we really do rely on food intake. But that kind of is the second point, is that we're not great at consuming enough vitamin D as part of our diet. So I really like these images. They're taken from a large national study that used data collected from older adults. And this was a group in Trinity College in Dublin that did this research. And just the colour guide across the four maps here indicates that the proportion of the population that have vitamin D levels that are lower than the cutoff that defines sufficient. So they're not necessarily deficient in vitamin D, but they don't have enough vitamin D, or they don't have the amount that we would like them to have. So what's really concerning is that for almost half the year, about half of the population is not at the level that we'd like them to be at. And although this is older adults, we know that it's similar for other life stages too. So as I mentioned to you, the color coding in that previous slide is telling us that certain people are insufficient kind of year round, and the rates are higher, I suppose, in kind of the winter and early spring seasons where we really get very little sunlight. What I want to kind of point out on this slide is that when I talk about being insufficient, I'm talking about having a vitamin D level, or a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level, which is the biomarker that we use to indicate whether someone is deficient, insufficient, or sufficient with respect to vitamin D. So I'm saying that if you have a vitamin D level, or 25-hydroxy vitamin D level that's lower than 50 nanomoles per liter, then you're in a category that we say you have insufficient vitamin D. And what I'm showing in the previous slide is that, as I said, for kind of half of the year, over half of us are in that category, and that's not where we want to be. A person is considered deficient if their 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels are less than 30 nanomoles. But when I'm talking about insufficient, it's anybody below 50. So I've also listed a couple of the dietary recommendations on this slide, and you'll notice that there's 4 different numbers written down. And the reason for that is that the recommendations are different depending on a person's age. So I've highlighted the 10 micrograms as that is the one for children and adults. The 5 micrograms is what the recommendation is for babies and preschool children. And then the 15 and the 20 micrograms is what the dietary recommendation is for older adults, with the higher value being the recommendation for older adults who are housebound primarily and really do have limited sun exposure. So there's quite a range there, but it's important to kind of identify which one or which category you should be in and make a note of that. We know that most of us year round are not actually getting that amount of vitamin D in our diet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the foods as well, where we get our vitamin D from. Okay, so before I go into that, I just want to highlight for those who need to pay a little bit of extra attention to their vitamin D intake. So I've already said that kind of half the year we're not getting enough, or our status is generally low. And then I'm also saying that relative to recommendations, typically we don't consume enough from our food. And then there are, as I said, there are particular groups within the population that it's important to kind of keep an eye on our vitamin D intake. So first of all, infants and preschool children. And so we have a specific recommendation for babies less than 12 months. They should be given a 5 microgram supplement every day. We also have a recommendation for preschool children that in winter months, and the recommendation is from Halloween until St. Patrick's Day, that they should also be given a 5 microgram supplement. So they're an obvious group that we're concerned about. We also, all of us need to pay attention to our vitamin D intake levels when sun exposure is low. So in Ireland, that essentially means between November and about March. So similar to that recommendation for the preschool children, we really need to keep an eye on what our vitamin intake levels are, because we're really reliant on diet for those months of the year. Also, people with darker skin tones need to pay attention to their vitamin D intake because they tend to make less even when exposed to sunlight. And then the last age group, again, older adults, there is a specific recommendation for that higher dietary intake of 15 or 20 micrograms. And that's due to lack of synthesis and lack of sun exposure, as well as variety in diet. So in older adults, that recommendation is even higher. So what foods contain vitamin D then? Well, I've already mentioned that we make vitamin D when our skin is exposed to sunlight, but we do also get it from foods. So although only a few foods are naturally rich in vitamin D, and examples on this slide here that you'll see are things like liver, oily fish, and eggs. The richest sources of those naturally kind of natural vitamin D source foods are things like liver and oily fish. But the thing is, we don't consume those types of foods regularly, particularly liver, and most of us aren't great at getting oily fish either. So we also fortify some foods in Ireland, and this is a voluntary fortification process. So foods like milks, dairy spreads or fat spreads, and breakfast cereals are often fortified with vitamin D as well. So that also kind of contributes to our day-to-day intakes. So this picture then shows the amount of vitamin D. So I mentioned already that oily fish is particularly high, but just to note that the percentages that are presented here on this slide are actually relative to the European recommendations. In Europe, the recommendation for vitamin D intake from food is 15 micrograms per day. So as you can see, the fish has the highest amount. If you're not familiar with this type of fish, it's similar to herring. Also, just to note that salmon, a portion of salmon would have about 15 micrograms per portion. For the fortified breakfast cereals and the eggs, both proportion contain about 3 micrograms per serving. So that just gives you an idea of how much vitamin D we get from these types of foods. So while we're talking about food sources of vitamin D, I thought it'd be interesting to look at the data a little bit to see what foods contribute to our vitamin D intakes in Ireland. So I went to the IUNA national survey data, and what you'll see here is on the top. Now, I know you can't see it, but I've picked out the key points. Top left is the preschool dietary intake data. Top right is children's dietary intake data. The bottom left is the teens, and the bottom right is the adults. And so firstly, all groups were consuming less than 5 micrograms of vitamin D per day. So that's at least less than half of the recommendations for most people, and higher or even less for the older adults who should be consuming 15 micrograms. The food groups that contributed most across the different age categories were meat, fish, milk and yogurt, eggs, breakfast cereals, and bread. So I just want to keep that in mind when we go and look at the research that we're doing in UCD that's looking at improving intakes. It's important to know kind of in our diets, what are the kind of most frequently consumed foods that are contributing to our vitamin D intake. And then lastly, just before I go on to that, talk about that research, I haven't really talked much about why we think, or why vitamin D is so important. So just firstly, I suppose one of the main functions of vitamin D is to help balance the levels of calcium and phosphorus in our bodies. And we need calcium and phosphorus to form our bones and our teeth. We also need them to help our muscles contract and to help nerves carry messages between our brain and our body, and essentially just to keep our cells functioning well. We also know that vitamin D is important for supporting the healthy function of our immune system. And this is something that we're hearing more and more over the last few years. So that brings me to our research. And I'm presenting a series of work that we've done here in UCD as part of the NutriPlus study. And this is actually Aislinn's PhD research. So she will also be able to answer questions on this at the end as she's here with us this evening. So essentially, this project was looking at how we could improve vitamin D status. And we were actually focusing mainly on older adults in this. So you'll hear me mention older adults a couple of times. So just to kind of kick off, how can we improve vitamin D status in Ireland? Well, in an ideal world, we might just try to row ourselves down a bit further south, but I don't think that's probably an option. So failing that, we have two other options. And the first is to increase our intakes of vitamin D by increasing food concentrations. Or thirdly, and potentially, to increase intakes by improving how much we are absorbing from our food. So these are the things that we were trying to look at as part of this NutriPlus study. Okay, so as I said, sorry there, I'm after skipping over. Our first study was to look at, well, could we increase intakes by just increasing the amount of vitamin D in foods? And as I said, this work was done by Aisling McCourt, who will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So just to start, this was a piece of data analysis, kind of desk-based data analysis. And again, we used data that was collected as part of the National Adult Nutrition Survey, and also focused on adults just over the age of 50 in that cohort. So we were particularly interested in older adults' food consumption and improving that. So we first updated the composition of foods to reflect the current vitamin D concentrations in food, and we did that using primarily food packaging data. We also created a variable so that we could group food intake into foods that had natural vitamin D and foods that had added or fortified vitamin D, just so that we could look at the two angles. So that was the first step. Then we looked at how much vitamin D people were eating day to day. So we started by looking at kind of how many were consuming greater than 20 micrograms. So if you remember back, the recommendations for certain older adults was to be consuming greater than 20 micrograms. So less than 5% of the population were consuming over 20 micrograms a day. Then we kind of worked backwards from there. Then we saw that 10% were over 15 micrograms, 20% were over 10 micrograms, but overall 80% of people were less than 10 micrograms, which is the adult recommendation and not even specifically the older adult recommendation, which is 15 micrograms. So already just starting out, we know that intakes of vitamin D are low, and I've kind of commented on that a couple of times. The other question, as I mentioned, was to say, well, how much of that is coming from fortified foods or coming from natural sources? And we saw that about 60% of the vitamin D was coming from added food or fortified foods. And of those, bread and milk were the most frequently consumed. So when we were going on to model what would happen if we increased concentrations, we selected out bread and milk as our two options for adding vitamin D to. So this slide can get a little bit complicated. So I'm just going to focus on the take-home messages that form part of this research. So we essentially calculate what people would be consuming based on different combinations of adding vitamin D to either milk, bread, or a combination of the two. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the kind of main findings from this research. So firstly, if we added 2 slices of bread to what people were already eating, and this was 2 slices of fortified bread, then their kind of average intake of vitamin D would work out to be 16.4 micrograms. So that means that we could get to a point where 83% of the cohort would be over the 10 microgram cutoff for intakes, okay? However, that would mean adding extra energy to people's diets because it was adding bread to what they were already consuming. So that isn't ideal. If we change that and just fortified bread that people were consuming already, that would increase their intakes to 12.8 micrograms. So still doing okay in that scenario. We did the same with milk. And as you can see, we were able to increase intakes that way as well. So the increase would be to 10.5 micrograms if we added a glass of fortified milk to everybody's diet. But what worked best was if we combined the 2 approaches. So if we fortified the bread that people were already eating and fortified the milk that people were already drinking, then we were able to increase vitamin D intakes to 15.2 micrograms. So that was without adding any extra food into their people's diets, if that makes sense. So essentially, overall, what that work was showing was that fortifying commonly consumed foods was effective, and that combining a number of foods, and in this case, we combined bread and milk, it was better than just fortifying one type of food alone. Also, I should mention here that in this analysis, no participant exceeded the 100 microgram, what we call tolerable upper limit for vitamin D intake. So based on this modeled data, this level of vitamin D fortification is safe for public consumption. So the next question then was to look at, well, can we improve vitamin D status by attempting to manipulate the food so that we try to absorb more of the vitamin D from the food? And so I'll just talk you through what we did in this case. So this is option 3. Can we improve how much vitamin D we absorb from food? So there is actually very little known about vitamin D absorption. There are only a handful of studies that have measured that kind of immediate period after you consume something. And there's various reasons for that. It can be quite invasive. It's very time consuming because vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin, meaning that it's kind of more slowly digested and absorbed. So that has implications then for research. But what we do know is that vitamin D is part of the fat component of foods, and that we can absorb more vitamin D when it's consumed as part of a meal that contains fat. So our research question, and what I'm going to present to you here, is firstly, can we improve vitamin D levels by fortifying foods to the same extent that you would be able to improve your vitamin D levels if you consumed a vitamin D supplement? And then secondly, does the type of fat in the food impact the amount that we absorb and the change in vitamin D levels as a result? So you'll see in the picture here that we use 2 types of oils when making the study drinks for this study. One was coconut oil, which is more medium chain fatty acids, and one was olive oil, which has more long chain fatty acids. Both drinks were fortified with 20 micrograms of vitamin D. And so really we were asking the question, does the length of the fatty acid impact the absorption and therefore impact the change in vitamin D levels that we see after this 4 weeks of supplementation? And our hypothesis, or what we expected to happen, was that the longer chain fatty acids in the olive oil might be better for absorption than those medium chain fatty acids in the coconut oil. So for this study, we recruited healthy adults. We had men and women, and we divided them into 4 groups. So one group drank the coconut oil based, and it was a kind of a type of dairy drink, and it was fortified with 20 micrograms of vitamin D, and they had that every day for 4 weeks. Another group had the same, but with the olive oil as the fat component. The third group had a dairy drink with no vitamin D, and then the fourth group, for comparison, consumed a vitamin D supplement every day for 4 weeks. And so during this 4 weeks, or kind of before and after, we measured diet, we measured height and waist circumference, and we took blood samples to measure the change in vitamin D status, and also other blood markers of metabolic health. And we did that, as I said, before and after the 4 weeks so that we could compare the effect of the intervention across the different groups. So, okay, I'm going to start by presenting some of the baseline data. So this is basically just taking the cohort or the participants that came into the study at the very start and measuring a couple of different things. So if you focus on the pie diagram, so the circular diagram on the right-hand side, you'll see that almost 70% of the cohort were classified as vitamin D sufficient at baseline. And this is actually higher than what we would expect for this cohort based on our nationally representative sample. In the same group, 22% were insufficient. So as I said before, that's less than 50 nanomoles per litre, and then 9% were deficient. So that's less than 30 nanomoles per litre. So looking to the dietary intake data then next, and that's the bar graph to the left of the pie chart, only one person was consuming more than 15 micrograms per day. 9% were consuming between 10 and 15 micrograms, and 28 were between 5 and 10 micrograms, and the majority, 62%, were less than 5 micrograms, which is similar to what we're seeing in the national survey data as well. So it's to be expected. When we looked at the characteristics of the participants that were connected to their vitamin D status, we saw that those who had sufficient vitamin D levels, so those with vitamin D more than 50 nanomoles, were also consuming more vitamin D in their diet. So that's to be expected. They're eating more and they have a better status. We also saw that those who were vitamin D deficient or insufficient, so those on the lower side, had higher waist circumference measurements, meaning that they were carrying more weight around their middle. Okay, so this is the main findings of the study. And again, a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try and talk you through it as best I can. The first thing that I want to kind of show you is that on the left-hand side, when you look at changes in vitamin D levels over the 4 weeks, those who started out with a low level, so on the left-hand side where you're looking at the graphs, those who started out that were insufficient, so that lower than 50 nanomoles per litre, responded differently to those that started out as sufficient. So those who came in kind of insufficient versus those who came into the study sufficient, we saw differences in how well their vitamin D levels improved. So we broke these down into 2 groups to look at the changes in the 2 groups instead of combining them into 1 group because they were so different. And also, before I compare the results of our 2 groups, I want to highlight the different y-axis scales. So that means that the scale of the graph on the bottom is different to the scale on the graph at the top. So even though it looks like the angle of those lines is actually the same, it's not. What you're seeing on the bottom is that those who were consuming a vitamin D drink or supplement in the insufficient group on the bottom graph, they saw an increase of nearly 30 nanomoles per litre over the 4 weeks. Whereas those who improved their vitamin D when they were starting out with sufficient vitamin D levels, so the top graph, they only improved by about 6 or 7 nanomoles per litre. So there's quite a difference in terms of how these two groups respond to the supplement. Anyway, as well, as you can see by the red lines, all of the vitamin D supplemented participants, so you'll see 3 red lines on the bottom graph, all of them improved their vitamin D really well. And no one treatment was better than the other. And I suppose the take-home message there is, if you're starting off with a low vitamin D level, it's very likely that you will respond to any type of fortified food or supplement pretty well, because you're starting at such a low baseline. In comparison, if you look at the top graph, you do see a difference between the different treatment groups. So when you dig into this, you can see that the change in the vitamin D levels of those that were consuming the coconut oil supplemented drink and those that were consuming the actual supplement pill improved more than the olive oil dairy drink. And as you can see, the placebo group, or those that were getting no vitamin D, actually decreased. You see that as well for the insufficient participants, that black line, that's the group that got no vitamin D, and there's essentially no change in their level or even a slight decrease. It's also kind of worth noting here that 94% of participants who were consuming a vitamin D fortified drink or supplement were classified as sufficient at the end of the study. So that means that this big group of insufficient participants in the bottom picture, all of their vitamin D levels improved so much that they were now above that cutoff of 50 nanomoles at the end of the study. So I suppose what that's saying is that 20 micrograms of vitamin D per day is good at improving your levels above that cutoff. There was only 3 participants that didn't reach that 50 nanomole concentration, but they were very close to it. They were about 45 nanomoles per liter as opposed to 50. Okay, so this is my last slide, and just to kind of finish off with some of the key messages from this work. So in Ireland, vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency rates are high, particularly in winter months, and particularly this kind of period from Halloween to St. Patrick's Day, when we don't have kind of much sun exposure and therefore we're not synthesizing vitamin D. To compound this though, we are also not getting enough in our diets. Based on our modeling data, so that first kind of piece of research that I presented, it seems clear that we can reach vitamin D intake recommendations with food fortification, and fortifying a combination of foods will be more effective, essentially. It seems as though there is scope, and this is, I suppose, based on the last piece of research that I showed you. It seems as though there's scope to manipulate absorption by changing the lipid component of foods. However, there is still a lot of unknowns with respect to vitamin D absorption, and there is still a lot more that we'd like to do to investigate that a bit more. We also did see quite a bit of variation in how individual people in that study responded to the different study drinks. So again, that's another really important thing for us to kind of go on and look at. Lastly, I suppose, from our intervention study, it's clear that fortified foods are effective, and they are as effective as the traditional kind of pill type supplement. And therefore this offers kind of significant scope to increase vitamin D status, which might be particularly important for certain groups. So I mentioned at the start that kind of babies and young children and then older adults are kind of more at risk of vitamin D deficiency. These are kind of groups that might be less likely to introduce new foods into their diet. So it might be more difficult to introduce oily fish or liver to try to increase those vitamin D levels. There are also groups where swallowing might be a difficult issue, and so taking a supplement could be more challenging. And so in that case, a liquid or a soft fortified food might actually work better than a supplement even. All of that combined, I think we can conclude by saying that there's strong evidence for mandatory fortification based on what we're seeing both in the kind of survey data where we're looking at intakes, and then in that kind of modeling data and the recent fortification study that we did. In this case, fortifying dairy foods worked really well. I think there's more that we need to look at, and we're just kicking off another study where we're going to look at what would happen if we could fortify breads. So this new study is with UCC and Teagasc, and it's just after starting. And we're going to take a two-pronged approach in that. We're going to look at older adults, but we're actually going to look at family-based intervention as well. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And we'll be looking at, again, if we fortify bread, what could that potentially do to our vitamin D levels? And would that be a route to go for mandatory fortification for Ireland? My last slide then is really just a thank you slide. And again, highlighting Aisling, who has done all of the work, all of the research work that I presented here, but we were part of a bigger team that was the NutriPlus team in UCD. So Professor Dolores O'Riordan was the lead, Dr. Graham O'Neill and Stephen Mulrooney, who was a PhD student at the time, now graduated as well. He also did a lot of the work on this study. So just to say thanks to the whole team and to the Department of Agriculture who funded the research.